All right. Hey, everyone. So, welcome back. We are, of course, still talking about this idea of how do we get a good grasp of what our external environment looks like operating within this industry that we've chosen to be a part of. Now, so far, we've talked about this idea of the Porter's five forces, our way of assessing what the reality is like in our industry for all of us. We've also kind of talked about what these driving forces are like that will likely lead to change and lead to things being different in our industry, what that means, and how we prepare for that strategically. But what's also good for us to get a good grasp on is not just like what the landscape's like for everyone, but understanding a little bit more about our competitors and what their market position, what we call their market position, is really looking like. So today, that's what we're going to kind of look a little bit more into, getting a grasp of this idea of what the market position of our rivals is really looking like. And so we're going to use this by using a technique called strategic group mapping. Now, first and foremost, one thing we want to get a grasp of is this idea of what a strategic group is. So a strategic group, all we're talking about is kind of a cluster of rivals within our industry that all of these rivals are going to be employing a similar competitive approach. All right. They may have product or offerings that appeal to similar types of buyers, and thus, they occupy what we would say similar market positions. So a strategic group map is one way that we visualize which firms are close competitors and which of ours are not. So while our Porter's five forces and our industry reality, that kind of stuff is basically like broad sweeping. It's something that is the same for all of our competitors, everybody that operates within this industry. We do also then take all of the individuals within the industry and we do start to create what we call strategic clusters. We start putting them together and saying, like, not everybody in my industry is as big of a rival to me as everyone else, right? There are varying levels of how competitive I am against other people based off of important things like what kind of value do they provide? Are they, are they a cost leader, like a low price, or are they a really high quality competitor? What's that, like, how do we determine these kinds of things? We use the strategic map that looks something kind of like this, okay? So essentially, we can use different variables along these different axes. Now, just as an example here, because the two ways that we tend to really differentiate the type of value that a business provides in an industry is either through, price competition or through differentiation, or a lot of times we look at that as like a measure of quality, right? Some competitors might be focused on quality and some might be focused on low price. And we understand those two things can very rarely, exist in tandem with one another. So some, like we see in the top left here, like, Gucci, Chanel, Prada, Burberry, Louis Vuitton up here, they're in a very different section of this same industry than someplace like Walmart in the bottom right down there. So variables used in these axes, they can't be highly correlated between the two. So what we're looking at here is like, what kind of value does it offer, price versus quality, and how much geographic coverage does this firm have, right? How many stores, how easy is it to find one of these stores anywhere, kind of thing. So when we look at it from this standpoint, we break it down based off of, these are the elements we're determining about that are going to determine who's in our strategically competitive cluster. We've just chosen a few characteristics here. These aren't the end all. So this is just an example for you. So if there are more than two, important competitive variables, you could draw several maps. You could compare lots of different things in order to see who's your closest or farthest competitors based off of a number of different competitive characteristics. But this one is just an easy one for us to wrap our head around. What's important to remember, not all these positions are even strategically attractive to some other firms. So, if we look at it like this sense, we look at the Macy's, Nordstrom, Dillard's, Belk right there, that kind of eggplant colored circle. and we then compare it to Kohl's, like Kohl's, Ross, J.C. Penney's, we can see that maybe Macy's, Nordstrom, and those, they're a little bit higher on the quality range, but they're very similar in geographic coverage. These two circles, as we can see on this diagram, they're actually quite close. So we might say that based off the fact that these strategic, like their strategic mapping placements are quite similar, they're close to each other, they're likely to be kind of highly competitive against one another in this industry. Whereas by contrast, if we look at someone like Walmart versus Gucci, we can see that their value propositions are very different. Gucci's all about value, or about quality, excuse me, and Walmart's all about low price. These put them in very different strategic quadrants, and Walmart's everywhere. Gucci's going to be far, far more limited number of stores and placements. So therefore, like these two, they don't have a lot of overlap in these important characteristics. So if we were assessing whether or not they're part of a competitive cluster based off of these two competitive elements, we would say, no way. They may exist. They may both, sell clothing and accessories, but they are definitely not competitors, right? So we can understand that just because someone else does what we do does not make them a legitimate threat all the time, does not make them a close rival, does not make them a member of our strategic cluster. So understanding that we can create these strategic maps based off of lots of different things, but the way we're looking at it here, we can understand that, by doing this, we can see and get a better idea of which different rivals or competitors we should pay attention to and which ones are really not so important for us because they really don't pose any intense threat to us, right? By doing this, we can get a good idea about who our rivals are and pay attention to this very important question that we like to pay attention to quite a lot when assessing our external environment is, what's their likely next move, right? So making sure that we closely monitor things like this about our competitors and we are adequately preparing our defensive, our front against it. This is one of the only things that we can do in order to safeguard ourselves from suffering a really damaging loss, like it says here, right? So essentially we want to regularly try to assess what we think their next moves are. That is not necessarily the easiest undertaking for us, but we want to figure out based off that strategic map, what rivals are likely to make adjustments, right? The ones that are about to make adjustments are largely going to be ones that are probably in more saturated areas on here. When we look here about where there are big clusters of them all together, those are ones that probably need to continue to make regular competitive adjustments, right? Because they're going to have bigger concerns about their performance based off of higher competition within their cluster. We also can get a good idea of which ones are likely to gain or lose market share and which competitors are likely going to rank among our industry leaders in the future based off of their competitive position. Understanding these elements gives us some insight into which rivals are going to be increasing or decreasing, let's say unit sales, market share by expanding, exiting different geographic markets, or expanding and constricting their product segments, or even making decisions to acquire other firms, or potentially making the decision to be acquired as a firm. So while this is not necessarily an easy thing to assess, what we can pay attention to by looking back at this strategic mapping is we can get a good idea as to which other companies in our industry are most important for us to pay attention to, which ones that might pose the most significant threat to us, and the ones that we need to essentially keep a really good eye on and assess their future moves so that we can make the correct strategic moves to counteract those and safeguard ourselves from the potential negative outcomes that might result from them.